There was no reason to believe that this would work. In 2024, when Dexter Resurrection was first announced, the reaction was mostly skeptical, and understandably so. Dexter's story had already been concluded, or at least attempted to be concluded, twice. First in the widely disliked Season 8 finale, and then in New Blood, which, while better executed, ended with a death that was both definitive and controversial. So when Showtime revealed they would be bringing the character back, most people assumed it would be a final cash grab, the kind of lazy revival that networks use to capitalize on existing IP with the least amount of creative effort. And in all honesty, it should have been that. But it wasn't. What we got instead was one of the most unexpected redemption arcs in recent television history. Not just for a character, but for an entire franchise. For many fans, Dexter, New Blood was a contradiction. It started as a promise, a quieter, more mature revival. One that stripped away the absurdity of Dexter faking his death and hiding in a hurricane, and instead grounded the story in the snowy stillness of Iron Lake. It offered something viewers had been asking for: consequences. Dexter couldn't keep killing forever. He couldn't live two lives without paying for them. At some point, justice, or some version of it, had to catch up with him. But when that moment finally came, the execution felt rushed. The death of Dexter at the hands of his son Harrison was meant to be poetic, ironic, inevitable. But it landed with discomfort more than resolution. Not because it was shocking, but because it didn't feel earned. Harrison, a character who had spent the season oscillating between rebellion and confusion, suddenly pulled the trigger, and with it, brought the series to an abrupt moral high ground that didn't quite fit the character it was built on. The writers seemed to know this. And that's where Resurrection finds its starting point. Not by undoing what happened, but by reframing it. Rather than retcon the death, Resurrection lets it sit in the background, untouched. It treats the ending of New Blood not as a mistake to correct, but as a wound to study. Harrison is now traumatized. Not just because he thinks he killed his father, but because deep down he doesn't understand why he did it. He was manipulated, pressured, and isolated. The moment didn't resolve anything for him. It opened something darker. This approach is subtle, but deliberate. It allows Resurrection to begin not with action or escape, but with grief. And that grief, shared by both characters from different sides of life and death, becomes the emotional architecture of the show. Instead of chasing redemption, the narrative quietly asks a different question. What happens when the son who thought he killed his father finds out he didn't? And more importantly, what does the father do with the knowledge that he survived, but wasn't supposed to? These questions are never directly stated, but they shape every scene that follows. And that's where the brilliance of Resurrection begins, not in rewriting the past, but in exploring its damage. Resurrection opens with an almost surreal tone. Dexter is alive. The explanation for his survival is at best medically unlikely. The heart was missed, emergency care was available. There are holes in the story, but what matters is how little time the show spends justifying it. It's addressed, but not obsessed over. This is a deliberate choice, and perhaps a wise one. Because Resurrection isn't interested in realism. It's interested in legacy, and how people escape or succumb to it. Whether Dexter survived for logical reasons becomes less important than what he chooses to do with the second chance he's been given. And what the show does next is both risky and surprisingly effective. It begins to reintroduce characters from the original series. Ghosts, flashbacks, hallucinations, names and faces that haven't been seen in over a decade. And yet somehow it doesn't feel cheap. Because Resurrection is not a nostalgia show, it's a story about being haunted. Within the first 10 minutes of episode 1, we see the return of Arthur Mitchell, Miguel Prado, and even Sergeant Dokes. Figures who were once central to Dexter's rise and fall. But they don't appear as traditional cameos, they function more like extensions of Dexter's mind. It's an interesting creative decision, one that could have easily failed. But here it works because the show finally treats Dexter's internal world as unstable, haunted, disconnected, and full of guilt. These aren't memories, they're confrontations, ghosts of decisions he can't undo. Where New Blood limited itself to Deborah Morgan as the only inner voice, Resurrection expands the psychological cast, turning Dexter's mind into a courtroom of moral arguments. Each ghost has a purpose. Each represents a different version of justice, morality, or instinct, and the result is a far more layered Dexter Morgan than we've seen in years. One of the most anticipated outcomes of New Blood was the idea of Batista finding out the truth. The original series ended without ever letting this happen. New Blood teased it, but Resurrection fulfills it. And it doesn't rush it. Batista's return is slow, methodical, and emotionally devastating. He doesn't immediately pursue Dexter. He sits with the information, he wrestles with it. And when he does act, he does so with conviction, but not rage. This is one of the smartest decisions the show makes, because Batista is not just a detective. He's a man who has suffered loss. His reaction isn't vengeance, it's personal responsibility. When he and Dexter finally confront each other in episode 7, the scene doesn't rely on action or shock. It relies on pain. Two people who trusted each other, now divided by a decade of lies and blood. It is not just the best scene in the season, it's one of the best scenes in the franchise. But the emotional weight of the season isn't only built on returning characters. It's also carried by something entirely new, the introduction of Leon Prater. Unlike many past antagonists, Prater is not a single killer operating in isolation. He's something more dangerous, a leader, the head of a network, a kind of ideological serial killer who recruits others to his way of thinking. This concept could have been absurd, but the show grounds it in quiet horror. The idea that Dexter is no longer unique, that his so-called code, his rules, are not exclusive or noble, that others exist who kill with their own set of justifications. It's a direct challenge to Dexter's identity, and it's effective. Characters like Mia Lepierre and the Gemini Killer help build this world out, adding variety to the types of killers Prater has gathered. Some are theatrical, some are cold, all of them are committed, and Dexter for the first time is not the predator. He's the prey. Or at the very least, one of many. The most surprising strength of Resurrection is the development of Harrison. In New Blood, his character often felt like a narrative device, a way to accelerate Dexter's fall. But here he becomes something else entirely. Harrison begins the season burdened by guilt. In his mind, he killed his father. And even after learning Dexter survived, he cannot simply move on. There is trauma, mistrust, pain. The writers don't skip over this. They lean into it. The father-son bond is rebuilt slowly. It's not a montage, it's a process. And more importantly, it reverses the usual dynamic. Where Dexter once shaped Harrison, Harrison now challenges Dexter, forces him to reflect, pulls him towards something resembling normalcy. Their connection in the final episodes feels earned. When Harrison saves Dexter from Prater, it's not just an act of rescue, it's an act of forgiveness. No show is perfect. For all its achievements, Resurrection does have weaker elements. Detective Claude Wallace and her music-driven intuition comes across as gimmicky. Her reliance on staying alive as a thinking tool feels cartoonish in an otherwise grounded season. And her character, while prominent early on, fades into the background by the end. The New York Ripper subplot also underdelivers. What was teased as a major mystery concludes with the reveal of a character who has no previous connection to the Dexter universe, Don Fram. For a show that built itself on callbacks and consequences, this choice feels disconnected. And then there's Elsa, a character introduced as a potential love interest or emotional counterbalance to Harrison. She's quietly removed from the story midway through the season, with no real closure or payoff. Theories exist, but the show offers no answers. Despite these issues, Dexter Resurrection succeeds in the one area that matters most. It makes us care again. It takes a story that had already ended and not only continues it, but enhances it. It gives depth to characters who were previously shallow. It brings back figures we loved without making them feel like props. It challenges Dexter in ways we haven't seen before. And perhaps most importantly, it ends not with another cliffhanger or a shocking twist, but with something much harder to achieve. Satisfaction. There is a sense of peace, of direction, of earned evolution. If this series goes on for another 2 or 3 seasons, as is currently rumored, it may very well cement itself as one of the greatest second acts in television history. Not because it did something new, but because it did something very old and very rare. It listened. Let me know what you thought of Dexter Resurrection. Was it the revival you were expecting? Or did it surprise you like it did me? If you want to support the channel, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who still hasn't given the show a second chance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.